Hey everybody, welcome back to Soul Science with Risa. Let's talk about the chakras. Now, there is quite a bit of confused misinformation out there on the chakras, particularly on YouTube. It's very obvious that many people are doing copy-paste kinds of regurgitation of information when it comes to the chakras, and also pretty obvious that most people talking about them, at least on YouTube, don't have direct experience with the centers themselves. So with that in mind, we're going to do a very basic overview today, but I don't want you to overcomplicate it, and always be thinking about how can I relate this to my own direct experience. Do I currently have any sensitivity to the centers? If so, which ones? If not, I always recommend starting with the heart center on contemplations of love, or just starting to monitor your own emotional reactions through the day and checking in with where you feel that in the body. And that's not always guaranteed to be in a center, but it starts that awareness of starting to track and move your astral body basically. And eventually when we get more and more fine-tuned with that, we can start to get to the point where we can, let's say, when we're angered by something in our environment, we can feel a surge of Mars in its activation of the solar plexus, wanting to start a conflict or push something away. And then we begin to feel that in the body. So always tracking it back to where can I ground this and make it practical. And for those of you that are very interested in developing of that abstract astrological awareness, this will just be helpful in terms of comprehending very basic relationships and considering how the planets actually affect the body through the rays. Exoteric astrology, of course, tracks these patterns that the planets seem to have on the human being. We can look at a bunch of examples of how Saturn interacts during transits and in people's natal charts, and people will generally delineate restrictions, delays, having to, responsibility, all of these things that are typically associated with Saturn. But then isn't the question as to why do the planets have the effect that they do? What is the link between the planet and the body? Is it just, if you approach it in a psychological Jungian context, it's just a projection of our psychic energy? Or in the occult point of view, then we start going to the level of causality, because that's really what occult and esoteric means, is to go right to the center, the hidden, the inner, and then we get to the meta aspect. And so as a general point, when we consider this branch of occult study, we say that the seven rays are being blasted forth from the Great Bear, and they trickle down through different systems, and by the time they hit our solar system, they stream through the sun, and then they're anchored by the planetary beings, because every planet in our solar system is a being, it's alive, it's an entity. They are custodians of the rays, they beam the rays down, and then they hit because it's all vibration, right? So then they have different levels of resonance, and that's how they begin to trickle down and interact with the human system, and that happens through the 7 chakras. And each chakra corresponds to a gland. So at the level of the physical body, now we're moving into endocrinology. So this is how the planets have their different effects on the body. And based on this is where it gets really complicated, and I'm by no means an expert in this. I'm only very, very beginner in my own knowledge, okay? Enough to just speak to you about it in a general way, because you have to really get really nitpicky. It takes quite a bit of time and research. The 7 chakras, the glands, based on the person's level of development, certain, because we're in certain vibrational pockets, certain influences affect some centers, whereas later on in the path, they don't have the same effect anymore. Now you're attuning to different layers of frequency, and that's where the soul-centered chart starts working, or different planetary rulers start to more accurately describe the person's life, where exoteric astrology starts to fall flat. And that's because now that we're responding to different influences, we're checking into a different level of frequency, and now those forces are starting to trickle down and affect the body in a different way. Okay, so it's a whole vast, interesting science here. So we'll look at the planets and the rays. We'll recap that and look at some basic relationships. So to do that, here's a diagram that I prepared earlier. One of my amazing diagrams of my little dude. Little dude with his 7 centers. So let's do a quick recap of the rays and the centers as they correspond. So we've got ray 1, let's do them over here actually. Rays 1, rays 5, Anya, the mind, throat, creative center, creative activity center, heart, second ray obviously. 6th ray, solar plexus, we talked about that a bit in the last video. The 7th ray and 4th ray. Okay, so already off the bat, even though the rays correspond to these centers, the reality is that when we when we're having effects of planets or energies streaming through our system, the reality is that they can move up and down and affect one another altogether, especially when we consider endocrinology, because let's say, well, it's quite a well-known fact within astrology that full moon periods tend to correspond with more crime. Okay, so how might we play with that esoteric, with this information? We would say, okay, the moon, so the moon is a 4th ray planet. So right there we're talking about the activation of the root center, and that the root center corresponds to the adrenal glands, and that has a lot to do with fight and flight responses. So right there already we're talking about instinctual fear, quite deep levels of dense action and reaction in the body. Interesting. So yes, even though we're talking about just the moon and the 4th ray and this particular center, just even physically, the glands are all relating together. In endocrinology, they'll talk about a hormone cascade. So, your thyroid can go out and that affects this and that affects that, and then you have all kinds of issues with illness. And this is why when we're talking about the glands and the chakras, the reason why we don't have answers for things like chronic fatigue, for instance, which a lot has to do with the thyroid, and a lot of people have thyroid issues. And again, if we approach it with the rayology level of analysis, we're talking about the 3rd ray, which has a lot to do with the actualization of one's true expression. So living an inauthentic life, leading to things like chronic fatigue and thyroid issues. So every level of disease, again, by pulling it back to where does it first affect? Is it affected at the level of the chakras? Okay, but anyway, I went off on a tangent there. Point being, like, the adrenals could get activated and that floods the system, and that can affect this and this and this and this and this. So in that way, even though we're talking about these general attributions of the planets and the rays to certain centers of the body, they can all react and interplay together. And this is again why you need to be bringing it back to your own sensitivity, because that's where we need to be able to learn to track different movements in ourselves and start to appreciate how these different things are reacting in our own systems. And that's why you can't just have a blanket script in terms of, oh, when you go through this transit, this will get activated and that will lead to this activity. Of course not. We're much more complicated and intricate, and that's why I explained that. So they're the rays as they correspond to the chakras. I will just do I'll just use the first letter. Planets, so we've got Pluto, non-sacred, Vulcan, sacred, Venus, no non-sacred one there, Earth, non-sacred, Saturn, sacred, Heart, the Sun, as it's expressed exoterically as the personality, and Jupiter is the sacred one, Mars, non-sacred for the 6th, Neptune for the sacral, Uranus, no non-sacred, and then we've got Moon and Mercury. I just realised my mic was not in the ideal position as I was doing that, so I apologise if the sound quality was a bit unpleasant for a bit there. Hopefully I've solved that. So I'm just getting rid of the ray numbers now. I'll just stick them on this side. Okay, we'll bring it back. Okay, what do I want to keep it down to in this video? Let's just do a quick bridging between the core relationships. So pairings, root and crown have an affinity, And when we take away the specific random ordering, well, it's not random, but not consecutive ordering of the rays, and we just consider, let's say, starting from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, this would be 1 and 7 in terms of the actual just basic numbers within that system, like at a further away level of analysis. So rays 1 and 7 have an affinity, matter, spirit. Yeah? Sacral and throat. So we're talking about the elevation of the instinctual creativity, often resulting in the drive towards sex and reproduction, the elevation of that into the throat center, where the throat opens and we become able to actually express the soul. Generally speaking, the upper three centers don't get vivified until a certain degree of soul contact is made. That doesn't mean that there can't be stimulation in these upper centers. For instance, a lot of people, they make the mistake, for instance, of attributing the Anya center to the pineal gland, which is not the case. It corresponds to the pituitary body. In any case, people will go, oh yeah, I've got an open Ajna center. And they then proceed to describe psychic phenomenon. Psychic phenomenon has nothing to do with spiritual intuition. And when this is actually opened and vivified, the Anya, then we're talking about actual spiritual intuition, which is the knowledge. This is the bullseye point. We'll talk more about that when we get to signs like Gemini and Taurus. But the throat, the Anya, the crown, these require a lot more scientific development of ourselves and a lot more synthesis of the personality. And part of that synthesis is exactly dealing with whatever is going on down here so that they're able to then be transferred into here. And when I say transference, I don't mean that these become inactive, but these do become open, and then they have like a direct channel, so that now when we say that man's living below the diaphragm, they're elevated up into the heart, and now there's a building up here where we're starting to see a deeper integrity of how the human being is meant to operate, really, when all of these centers are in relationship with each other. Okay? So, root and crown, the sacral and throat, and as we spoke about last video, solar plexus and heart. So these are very basic ones. Of course, they all interrelate with each other, and I personally have had quite a strong experience of dealing with like having the root crack open and that triggering a cascade through the centers that have resulted in a lot of really warped Anya activity, like warped mental thought forms, which would make sense. Let's say you've got a lot of root issues and trauma stored in the most dense part of the body, and the roots connected to the legs and all of this. Let's say you activate that. Of course, if you've had a past trauma and your systems learn to kind of repress it and compensate in all these different ways, then that's going to have a trickling effect all through the system. So let's say you were, what's a generic one? Let's say you just had an abusive parent or something, and they were really cruel and harsh, and you had to shut down, and they cut you off from instinct, and then you had to basically buy into whatever narrative that the parent gave you. And so right there we've got a warping of astral activity, a warping of mental activity. So that's affected the Anya center. So now you've got all this like noise up here, this negativity that's directly connected to or built on top of what is fundamentally, let's say, a fight or flight survival issue that's happened relative to an abusive parent. And that goes all the way up. So then, you haven't been loved, so your heart center's shut down. And so that's playing into the fear aspect, or that's shut down your Mars response, which would help you go, hey, no, that's bullshit, don't treat me that way. So then the solar plexus has issues, and maybe you've repressed your voice as a consequence, and that's resulted in maybe repressive sexuality. So there's maybe health issues in the sex organs, or excessive sexuality where there's nowhere for your vital energy to go because there's no ability to translate that into any kind of creativity, etc., etc., etc. So all of this is to say that the system is very intricate, there's a lot going on, and it always comes back to checking in with your own direct experience and your own level of sensitivity in terms of being able to scientifically track what's going on within your own centers. And then in terms of the actual concrete information, you can start playing with the planets and transits and looking at effects on your system emotionally, or days where you feel particularly vital and vibrant, typical exoteric. And I mean, this all works with exoteric astrology, by the way. If you're going through a Mars transit through the first house and you go, oh, I've got a lot of physical energy. Well, we've got Mars and it's hitting the solar plexus, and it's like upping the vitality and the drive, and it's working with these lower centers. So yes, you may be an exoteric person responding to the planets only at a certain level of development, whereas maybe a person later down that developmental track might go through a Mars transit through the first house, and perhaps a battle is beginning to happen, this tug between the solar plexus and the heart maybe, or I guess that's Neptune, but let's say the selfish desires of the personality, like putting pressure on that which is trying to aspire to something greater, and that would look like something else in the body. So now it's not an experience of vitality, but now it's an experience of struggle and difficulty and all of this kind of stuff, and it brings alive the sign Scorpio, which is connected to Mars. So an infinity of potential explorations and investigations can be opened up when we start to consider the rays in relationship to the planets and the rays in relationship to the centers here. Not my most eloquent self today, okay? I feel like my brain these days is at about 35% capacity. Okay, it's a postpartum thing, the baby brain. Man, sometimes I reach for words and they're just not there. Like the synapse is actually just been burnt off or something. All this is to say, I hope that has made some sense and that has piqued your interest in terms of investigating your own system or considering the planets in this light, and spending a bit of time contemplating the glandular system. Might even be worth doing a bit of independent research on more of that physiological scientific lines and starting to build more of those bridges. But I think for today we covered the rays and the chakras, mentioned the planets in their relationship to them, and talked about the potential of the ways in which the whole system can interact with itself. So I think we'll leave it there for today, and I will see you next time.